Okay, thanks for that introduction, Mike, and thank you to everybody for coming today. I have to admit right at the outset that I had exactly the same reaction that Mark Williams had to being invited to give this Janus talk, and that is I was honoured, of course, and excited at the beginning, but as soon as I started to prepare the talk, the excitement quickly waned as I realised the impossibility of trying to cover 10 years of research in motor development in 30 minutes. But nevertheless, I have put something together. It might take a little bit longer than 30 minutes. I realised though, it dawned on me pretty quickly, that the invitation more or less was punishment. It's punishment for past bad behaviour at NASPA conferences. So with that in mind, I can only imagine what Bob and Larry and Jane have done at past NASPA conferences to deserve having to cover 40 years of research in 30 minutes. There was a silver lining, though, in all of this. When I surveyed the most popular textbooks in motor development over the last 10 years, of course, we've got the Kathy Hayward and Nancy Getchell books. We've got Carl Gabbard's book. We've got the Payne and Isaacs book. We've got the Gallagher, Osman and Goodway book. And of course, the what I refer to as the Cadillac of textbooks, the Sudgen and Wade book. And I say Cadillac basically because of the expense. This is... that the market is actually not that crowded, and there's room for at least one more textbook. And I could probably write one now and fill it with all of the research that I can't cram into this talk. So expect to see this forthcoming on bookshelves soon. All right, so joking aside, this was a difficult task. I took the inspiration for the title of my talk, Motor Development is Fundamental to Human Development, from a paper that Esther Thalen wrote in 2000. And you can see by the title of that paper that Esther was arguing that motor development should be seen as the foundation and future for developmental psychology. And I want to argue that Esther was actually wrong. Not really wrong. She just didn't go far enough. I think motor development really should be viewed as the foundation and future of human development. And I say that because there's really not any domain of development that is not touched by movement. Movement is central to everything. So I think it's more appropriate to consider its role in that broader scale. Now, at the end of Esther's paper, she actually had an agenda for the future. And she'd subtitled that agenda, It's Not Just Motor Any Longer. And when I was rereading the agenda preparing for this talk, I thought, well, this is brilliant. I don't have to think so hard after all. I can just use Thalen's agenda as a way to organise my analysis of the last 10 years of research. So that's basically what I've done. And in that agenda, Esther had laid out 6 areas where she thought there would be considerable expansion over the upcoming decades. And I'll quickly review those 6 areas. The first is in multimodal perception and action. The second is in formal models and robotics. The third is in embodied cognition. The fourth is in the neural basis of motor skill development. The fifth is in learning and plasticity, and the sixth is in cultural and individual differences. So my strategy basically is to highlight some of the most impactful research that's been done in the last 10 years relative to this agenda. I'm going to focus on the first 5 of these areas, just say a tiny bit about cultural and individual differences. And I'm biasing my analysis here to contributions that have been made by NASPA members. And I'm also going to take the opportunity to highlight a little bit of my own research because I'm not averse to some shameless self-promotion. Now, before I plough ahead, I want to pause for a moment just to review the main contexts in which research in motor development is done and the main audiences that consume this research. And I do this because I want to highlight the limitations of the approach that I'm taking. So there are four main areas as I see them, and they're not mutually exclusive. There's considerable overlap between the four. But the audience that Esther was talking to in this paper is really the audience of developmental psychologists and developmental cognitive neuroscientists. So that highlights one limitation to begin with. Most developmental psychologists are not concerned with lifespan development. They're concerned with what happens pretty early in life. And we know as developmentalists that development happens across the entire lifespan. So there's going to be a limitation then in the coverage and the talk. Now, we also know there's a big audience who are interested in clinical issues, and there's been a lot of research devoted to promoting motor development in children with special needs, children who have developmental coordination disorder, for example, ADHD, spina bifida, cerebral palsy, and a range of different orthopedic issues. And of course, this work is not really captured in the agenda. And then, of course, there is a big audience in public health and physical education that is not really captured in the agenda either. And you'll see at the end of my talk that some of the most impactful research that's been done in motor development over the last 10 years has actually been in this public health physical education domain. So, with those limitations in mind, let's get on to multimodal perception and action. And I'm going to start with some shameless self-promotion. I've been really privileged to have been involved in some work that's been spearheaded by Marianne Barbu-Roth in Paris that looks at the multimodal control of newborn movement patterns. And what Marianne has basically shown, and this is in the very first paper that we published together, was that if you take a group of newborns, and these are 3-day-olds, and you suspend them above a table onto which is projected a checkerboard pattern that is either static or flows towards the babies, that the babies will actually increase their stepping, their air stepping, in response to that optic flow pattern. So it seems that the newborn is prepared to regulate its stepping, in this case, in response to optic flow. And subsequent experiments have shown that you get an increase in stepping rate if the flow moves towards the baby as well as away from the baby, but there's also a degree of context specificity. So you can't see this very well, but in the bottom right-hand corner, there's a baby, a newborn, 3-day-old, standing on a squishy silicon mattress, and optic flows are projected towards the baby and away, and the baby only steps in response to the flow that moves towards them, not away from them. And we've also seen in subsequent experiments that we can actually stimulate newborn crawling with optic flow, and we can stimulate it with the smell of the mother's breast milk, as well as the mother's voice. So I think these findings are actually quite remarkable in that they show, again, that the baby is prepared at birth to regulate its actions on the basis of multiple sources of perceptual information. And I wasn't going to mention this particular finding, but I decided I will now, because now both Jane and Mike have brought this up. It's Esther's classic work on the disappearing stepping reflex, in which, of course, she's argued that stepping disappears because the legs become too heavy to lift. So it's really a biomechanical constraint that's the problem here. Well, we've published a couple of papers just recently challenging that explanation of the disappearing stepping reflex. And the challenge is based on the fact that when babies stop stepping on a surface, they continue to step in the air. So clearly, it can't just be about heavy legs. If the legs are too heavy to lift when the baby's on the surface, the legs must be too heavy to lift when the baby's in the air. So the story, I think, is a bit more complicated than we've been led to believe. But no more time to get into that. So the next example I've selected here is some of Daniela Corbetta's work on the development of reaching. And Daniela has been highlighting the importance of self-guided, multi-sensory motor exploration on the discovery and the selection of solutions to motor problems, like picking up an object, for a long time. And if you look at that cycle on the top right-hand corner of the slide, you see basically the successive perceptions and actions that are involved in reaching and grasping that allow the infant to match its movements to the environment. And what really differentiates Daniela's work is that in the past, people have looked at aspects of this cycle, but Daniela is actually looking at the entire cycle and showing how it all fits together. Now, the work on multimodal perception and action is not confined to infants, and it's not confined to reaching or locomotion, as evidenced by some of the classic work that's come out from Jane Clark and John Jaker, looking at the multisensory reweighting of postural control in children. They've done some classic experiments with infants, but in this particular work, they're looking at the integration of light touch information with visual information in the regulation of posture in older children. We see that integration changes over time. Okay, so shifting from multimodal perception and action to formal models and robotics, I'm actually going to go through this part of the agenda pretty quickly because there's been far less work in this area than one might have anticipated. And I think much of the work that NASPA members are familiar with, particularly in robotics, has been done in the motor control and the learning area, and it's been done with adults who are recovering from spinal cord injuries or who are recovering from stroke. So we see a lot of the application of robotics in this area. Again, not so much in the developmental area. The one exception, I would say, is the work that has been done on the development and design of powered mobility devices to help young children with locomotor impairments explore their environment and also learn to locomote. So on this slide, I've just highlighted the evolution of some of the robotics here. In the top three pictures, you can see some of the robots that we developed in the late 90s to basically test the role of locomotor experience on psychological development. And I'll talk about that in a moment. We just went to Walmart when we started this research and pulled toys off the shelf. We motorized them, we put joysticks on them, and we had babies driving around our lab. The bottom row highlights the evolution of these devices over the last 10 years. So on the far left, you see one of Cole Galloway's early robots. In the middle, there's a robot that's inspired by some of Peter Vishton's work. It uses a balance board as a control interface. And on the far right, I know you can't see this, is a device that Tubi Kolobi at University of Oklahoma designed called the SIPSI. It's a self-initiated prone progression crawler. And it's a very sophisticated robot that uses machine learning algorithms to help teach infants with cerebral palsy how to crawl. Now, shifting gears slightly, I couldn't give a talk about the last 10 years of research in motor development without covering some of the work that Nick Sturgio has done. The man is prolific, and that's an understatement. Now, Nick's work is not really in formal models, and robotics, but I couldn't figure out where else to shove it in. What Nick has done is basically highlighted for us the value of using non-linear data analytic tools to get into the processes that underlie the development of motor control. And here is just one example from a very highly cited paper, the one that was in the previous slide, showing that if you take non-linear measures of postural sway variability in sitting, you can differentiate between typically developing infants, the control strategies that they're using, and infants who are at risk for a later diagnosis of cerebral palsy. And the important point is that if you use the traditional measures of variability, you don't have the capacity to detect these differences. So, moving now from formal models and robotics to embodied cognition, this area has clearly seen some of the greatest growth in the last 10 years. Now, there's no consensus over what embodied cognition actually means, but people who are doing research in this area basically highlight the intimate connections between motor processes and cognitive processes. And there's no doubt that much of the work in this area has been inspired by Piaget's claim that the origins of intelligence are in the infant's and child's sensory motor interactions with the world. So, one more opportunity for shameless self-promotion. I think the work that we've been doing, and we, meaning Joe Campos and colleagues over at University of California, Berkeley, that links self-produced locomotion to psychological development is one of the best examples out there of the embodied nature of development. Now, just very briefly, I want to tell you a little about the framework for this research. It's basically inspired by Gilbert Gottlieb's probabilistic epigenesis. And probabilistic epigenesis, it's a mouthful, essentially says that development is a function of co-actions among a number of different factors that reside at different levels of analysis over developmental time. And this is essentially an inherently relational framework in that it focuses on the changing relations between the child and his or her environment. So when the child acquires a skill that changes the relationship between it and the environment, there have to be consequences for psychological development. And the more dramatic the change in that relation, the more dramatic are going to be the consequences for psychological functioning. But the way this works is like this. It's not the skill itself that's a critical variable. It's that the skill recruits the experiences that drive developmental changes in a range of different areas. So it's the experiences that are critical. The skill enables this to happen. And the acquisition of crawling is a classic example. Crawling is linked to a wide range of changes in a wide range of unexpected domains. But it doesn't start with crawling and it doesn't end with crawling. More recently, we've seen that there are a host of changes in unexpected domains associated with the onset of walking. And the people in this room, Jane and Daniela, have already contributed to this work by showing, for example, that infants return to two-handed reaching once they start to walk, and then there's a regression in seated postural control when infants start to walk. But one of the most interesting findings is this change in receptive and productive language. And I'm just going to highlight one study by Binchuan He and Eric Wally and Joe Campos that looks at the relation between walking acquisition and a spurt in receptive and productive language. I mean, I like this example because language is a classic example of a phenomenon that's embodied. For anybody who studies speech control, you know that controlling sound or producing sound results from some of the most complex motor coordinations that we can we can possibly develop. But anyway, in this case, what we see is that whether you look at a sample of American infants or Chinese infants, if you look at the infants who have walking experience, and those are highlighted in the dark bars, compared to infants who are the same age but are still crawling, you see that there are significant differences in the total number of words that are understood as well as the total number of words that are produced. Now, the Chinese infants are understanding more words, likely because they're older, and that's why this particular cross-cultural comparison was done. It's a converging research operation to follow up on the finding on the left. Now, switching gears a little bit, there's been a resurgence of interest in predicting later motor and cognitive abilities from early measures of ability, and this well-cited paper by Jan Peek and colleagues is a classic example showing that early fine and gross motor development predict later motor and cognitive ability. And then there's another great example provided by Mark Bornstein's group. And Mark has basically shown, this is quite remarkable, that 5-month-olds who are advanced motorically and who are more active explorers are actually superior in terms of their intellectual functioning and their academic achievement when measured at 11 years of age and also at 14 years of age. And the process by which all this happens, as you can see, is really, really simple and easy to follow. Okay, at the same time, we've focused on how the acquisition of motor skills influences psychological development. There's also been tremendous interest in the last 10 years in how exercise and physical activity shapes the developing brain. John Rady's book was published in 2008, and I think it's aptly titled because it really has been a spark for much of the work that's been done in this area. Phil Tomporowski is a leading figure in this research effort, and this is just one of many of his widely cited papers showing that an exercise intervention improves executive function and academic achievement in children who are overweight. Much of the work in this area that's been done over the last 10 years has been summarised in this excellent book that was recently published by Phil Tomporowski and Brian McCulloch and Katerina Pesch, who I know is here at the conference at least, maybe in the audience. And I should take this opportunity, I'm not going to go through the book, but to also acknowledge that there are people who we wouldn't normally consider in the motor development realm who have made a big contribution here. Jennifer Etnier, for example, has done a lot of work in this area. We've already seen a symposium yesterday at NASPA and several in the past, highlighting that this relation between physical activity and exercise and cognition expands across the lifespan. It's not just confined to children. Okay, neural basis of motor skill development. This is a big area. But interestingly, if you look at the NASPA members who have been involved in this area, there are many more who are in the motor control and learning area and the sport and exercise psychology area than in the motor development area. Nevertheless, I want to just highlight a couple of really important contributions in the motor development area. One is another example of work from Daniela Corbetta showing that there are changes in EEG coherence among homologous brain areas when you look at infants who are just starting to walk compared to experienced walkers and experienced crawlers. So there seems to be a reorganization in brain function that's happening at the onset of walking. And then there's this other widely cited paper by Jane Clark and Brad Hatfield, among others, showing that these close connections between motor processes and cognitive processes that we see at the behavioural level are actually paralleled by really close relationships at the level of brain structure. Learning plasticity, this is a big area in development, and it highlights for me why many of us have one foot firmly entrenched in the motor learning and control literature and another foot in the motor development literature. Because the processes that are associated with learning are clearly integral to the processes that are associated with development. I couldn't help but throw this in as an example. This is a paper that was only published a couple of months ago, but it was intriguing enough that I thought I should highlight it. This is work by Sigmundson showing that if you give 3 to 5 month old infants practice in standing between 3 and 5 months, oh, I already said that, practice in standing in the context of an infant swim program, they actually learn to stand independently during this age range. Now, what's remarkable about that is typically infants begin to stand independently somewhere between 9 and 11 months of age before they start to walk independently. So this is quite remarkable, assuming, of course, that it can be replicated. And standing, obviously, is a prerequisite for the development of a host of other more important skills, like, for example, wielding a machete. This is one of my nods to cross-cultural research. I don't have too many. Now, I think it's fair to say that most of the work on learning in the developmental area has been done in the context of learning to perceive affordances for action. Of course, the affordance concept is one of these fabulous concepts that James Gibson gave to us. And much of the work on affordance learning has focused on understanding how infants and young children come to understand those aspects of the environment that basically pose risks for self-harm. And this recent paper published by Carolina Bernet and Rita Cordoville is a classic example of this type of research. And this gives me an opportunity too to highlight the enduring contributions of the visual cliff paradigm. Much of the research in this area is inspired by the original work on the visual cliff. Now, the visual cliff's been criticised recently as a paradigm that's not ecologically valid, but I want to point out that whether you test infants on a visual cliff or any one of Karen Adolph's paradigms like the slope paradigm, the gaps paradigm, her real cliff paradigm, or this new innovative paradigm that was developed by Carolina and Rita that takes the experimenter out of the equation because it uses a harness system, that you get the same pattern of findings, that what determines whether infants will avoid these risky situations is locomotor experience. The more they have, the more likely they're going to avoid these situations. And if you want to, I don't have time to go through this, but if you want to read an explanation of how locomotor experience contributes to the development of this avoidance behaviour, you can take a look at that paper. It's fair to say that Karen Adolph has made a significant contribution, particularly over the last 10 years, to our understanding of how learning occurs in the context of the development, and this is just one of many of her well-cited papers highlighting learning in development. What's important is that Karen's basically shown us what we've known for a long time in motor learning, that to learn a skill, you require massive amounts of practice. But it's not just any type of practice. What infants and young children are getting is the type of practice that is most likely to benefit learning. So it's distributed in time, it's random, it's highly variable, it has all these characteristics that we know are important. Now, I can't not cover some of the really important contributions that Bev and Dale Ulrich have made to our understanding of motor development in the context of work they've done on learning and plasticity. And my time is running short here, so I'm going to go through this relatively quickly. Of course, you know, Bev and Dale have been doing a lot of intervention studies that are designed to promote motor development in infants with Down syndrome, spina bifida, and more recently autism. And they've really been pioneers in developing these interventions. And these are just a couple of the really well-cited papers. And I should point out that Bev recently wrote a paper in, well, it's not so recent now, 2010, in which she'd argued that we need to take advantage of early plasticity by starting interventions as early as we possibly can to ensure that they're as effective as possible. All right, so I'm going to wrap up my talk, and I'm going to go a little bit over. My apologies, but I'll go through this quickly, by highlighting the area of work that has actually been most impactful in motor development if you simply look at citations. And it's work that's focused on this relation between motor skill competence and physical activity. And I want to remind us of something that Jane said in her McCloy lecture back in 1995. It was subsequently published as that great paper on becoming skillful, patterns and constraints. She said, to begin, I offer a reminder to those in the broad field of physical activity and physical education in particular, that motor skillfulness is a critical component in achieving a nation of physically active people. Now, this is the paper that really has had probably the biggest impact, I think, in the last 10 years. It's the paper written by David Stodden, Jackie Goodway, Stephen Langendorfer, Marianne Roberton, Mary Ruddersill and Garcias, looking at this relation between motor skill competence and physical activity. And if you've been paying attention at the conference, you've seen this diagram probably 1,000 times already. So I'm not going to go over it in the interest of time. I will point out that Leah Robinson has recently published a review highlighting that many of the relations that are proposed within this model have been tested and that there is evidence to support them. And I think Leah will talk a little bit more about this later. And of course, this work has had an impact well beyond academia. It's been the basis for a number of interventions that governments have sponsored to try to get people more active. It's also been the basis for a number of interventions that are designed to promote the development of motor competence. And I want to finish by acknowledging that this stuff has not just happened in the US, it's happening all around the world. And as you would probably expect, some of the most influential work has been done down under. So this is the work that's been done by people like Tony Oakley, who's here for his very first NASPA conference, and Lisa Barnett, who I know has been to several NASPA conferences. And I'll just highlight one paper that has been particularly impactful, cited many, many, many times, published in 2009, accompanied by another paper in 2008, showing that childhood motor skill proficiency predicts adolescent physical activity as well as fitness. And this particular relationship has attracted a lot of attention. It's a relation between childhood object control proficiency and the probability of being engaged in vigorous physical activity. Very interesting prediction. So I figured I would run short on time, so I didn't have a formal ending to this talk, so I'm just going to end it by starting at the beginning and reiterating that motor development is fundamental to human development, and I think that we've seen that clearly in the research that's been done in this area over the last 10 years. Thank you.